This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us today on this Friday's program, we start with K-State grain market economist Dan O'Brien. He provides this week's grain market update as always and explains that stability in the markets may be farther off than originally anticipated. Dan O'Brien also provides this month's review of the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimate, otherwise known as the WASDE Report. He'll explain what we've been seeing globally. We end with this week's agricultural weather report from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond, who unfortunately explains that we will only see drought continue to persist for the foreseeable future. That and more awaits us ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now for our weekly grain market report. And as always, to cover this important topic, we have with us Dan O'Brien. He is our grain market economist here at K-State. So Dan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Samantha.
Absolutely. So as always, we're going to start with our grain futures. What do you say we start with wheat this week?
Sounds good. When you look at what's happened in the wheat market, we've certainly had a fall off of really a couple dollars from where we were about a month ago. And yesterday, as we were looking at the markets, you saw July hard red winter wheat, which is almost off the board now, closed at $8.67. But then September, which is now really what elevators are pricing off of, $8.57, et cetera. And it wasn't long ago we were seeing tens in front of wheat prices. And so part of that has to do, of course, with wheat harvest having come through and the availability now of wheat in the U.S. Part of it also has to do with the numbers that came out of the WASDE report that was held earlier this week, with indications that total production is not thought by the USDA to fall off quite as much as had been indicated. There are reports now of some movement between Ukraine and Russia with regard to the availability now of grain possibly coming out of that country. But you hear of that potentially coming about, that the Ukrainian ports on the Danube now are beginning to move grain more readily. So that's on the positive side. Still, there's just a lot of damage in that country. And the point is that there's some good movement there. Still, though, you look around the globe, European crops have been cut back because of dry weather there. We've got a report that came out regarding the extension of La Nina, the La Nina weather pattern on through the rest of this year. And we've already seen what problems in our country, much less South America, that's caused. So, we stand back and look at the wheat market and we see generally some indications of things looking a little bit better. And when we come to the time where we actually dig into the WASDE report numbers, we can look at both the falling short of hard red winter wheat production in the U.S., but some of the increases we've seen in some other wheat classes. So Kansas producers, I think overall, we've had mixed harvest reports, some in the central part of the state with really good yields, and in the western part of the state where we didn't have a fallow period prior to wheat being seeded last fall, generally reports of some pretty rough yields. So a lot of mixed variability, and those that did get wheat yields are still looking at prices that they're historically would be generally happy with. It's just that they're not the prices that we had a month ago. Their point of reference is not so much what we had the previous 3 or 4 years, it's what we just saw. And it's becoming apparent that a lot of that run-up that we'd had, again, was affected by drought in the U.S., of course, but also by all the worries in the world market with regard to Ukraine and Russia and general problems there.
As you mentioned, we've pretty much wrapped up wheat harvest in the state. I think Monday we said 95% of it was probably done in terms of what we still had left. And Marcia Boswell gave our last wheat harvest update yesterday in our program. So if you're looking for more information on how wheat harvest went, that key word there was really variability. I think that was the theme across the state. So if you're looking for more information on that, you can find that on agtoday.net on our podcast from yesterday. But as far as futures go, let's continue on here. We've still got soybeans and corn to cover.
Yes, for futures, in the materials that we put out each week on Ag Manager, there's an article out of DTN, and I'll just read the headline of it. It's by John Baranek, their meteorologist. Soil moisture deficits continuing at bad time for pollinating corn. Of course, high temperatures out here in western Kansas have our attention as irrigated corn, dryland corn, all coming into critical tasseling and pollination period, and high temperatures during that. And I think we classify 100 to 105 as pretty high temperatures. Historically, has at times done a lot of damage to corn. My office, of course, is out in the western part of the state, and we've seen some areas in the western part of the state really, really in rough shape on non-irrigated. Even under irrigated, we're hearing reports of water pumping allocation limits being met. And what a year for that to happen when they could really use the moisture and we have such good prices. So anyway, we have those issues at play. And you look at other parts of the country and look at soil moisture deficits, and you still see challenges in parts of Iowa on into Nebraska. That northeast Nebraska, northern Iowa corridor has been having ongoing dry conditions for several years, and they're probably wondering what they've done to deserve this. But it's been several years in a row where they've had similar conditions. Again, you just look in spotty manner all the way through the Corn Belt, and you have some areas that really, really have had soil moisture deficits. Even if they don't have soil moisture deficits, if they have extremely hot, dry weather, that can affect the viability, I hope that's right terminology, of pollen in that physiological process for corn. And so it's a time of great concern. Eventually, as we talk about the WASDE report and what it projected, one thing that causes consternation on the part of farmers as they look at that report is that the USDA still is projecting their linear trend line yield forecast of 177 bushels per acre. With the dry conditions that they have, at least raises a question whether we'll achieve that 177 bushels per acre figure.
Absolutely. And we're actually going to cover that with our meteorologist here at K-State, Chip Redmond, in the coming segment. And he'll cover that as well, just the concern and the pessimistic almost viewpoint. Not that, we're trying to be pessimistic. It's just what we've got in terms of weather, and that there doesn't really look like there's going to be some relief anytime soon.
The collision of information is that the USDA will not change that yield number until they get actual field data. And in August, they'll have farmer surveys. They may change it some then, but they really won't get in the fields themselves and make an adjustment until the September report. Wow. So we're not quote flying blind, but for those in the market that really rely on those USDA government report numbers, the response of those is likely going to be delayed. So if anything, it just sets us up for a lot of volatility around these government reports, an August report, but especially the September report, if we come in and show that we have major yield losses, and instead of the U.S. corn number of 14.6 billion bushels, if we're 250 to 500 million bushels or more less than that, then that'll have a major impact on the U.S. corn market.
For sure. And here we were hoping for some stability that time of year. That's usually the time where we're looking for that variability to really just settle down and us to have some stable markets. But with all of this coming in and weather not looking great, it might be otherwise, like you mentioned.
It's possible. And, with the concerns we have for corn in July for what's happening, if hot weather continues on into August, then we'll roll over into soybeans when they have their flowering, pod fill, critical reproductive time frame. So anyway, that's coming as well. And I think that when we stand back and look at soybean futures, I should mention before we get off of corn, and here I got us off of that before we got talked about it. These corn traded yesterday about $6, still historically a very good price. And lead futures September 608, basically 610, something like that. Still a chance for a lot of volatility movement. But when you look at that and compare that to soybeans, November soybeans, 1353 or 1350, 1360, something like that. Yesterday, as we were looking at those markets, and August higher than that, about 15 or so. So you're just, I guess, you're still seeing very good prices historically, but we had been seeing closer to 17 or so on the top end on that July contract not that long ago. I think any of our Kansas farmer clientele, probably a good amount of our agribusiness clientele, are standing back, seeing what they have at their local situation and seeing a lot of drought stress, and then at the same time seeing futures generally decline, and probably have strong questions about that. I guess I would say that the key question before us is this now the slide off into harvest, or do we still have the potential for slide off for lower prices off into fall harvest, or do we still have potential for volatility to come in and worries about crop size that could take us to higher prices. And I think that these high temperatures sure keep the possibility of volatility in the next 30 to 60 days on the table. We don't have just sterling crop conditions at all. We have some real questions to have to work our way through.
And as you mentioned, we were wanting to wrap up corn there, but there's still soybeans to cover, and we're concerned there as well. So
yes, we are. And I think the last USDA report, as it looked at soybean production numbers in the U.S., the main driver there was that I guess the carryover from the acreage report that did not indicate acres would be as high as had been expected. Mm-hmm. So you bring that into play, and you're still looking at 4.5 billion bushels projected in U.S. soybeans. But again, take about 2.6 million acres off the board, off our expectations, and now that number is lower. So what it does, in my thinking, whereas we were factoring in the high acres for 2022 and the possibility of very large carryouts, these lower acreage numbers I won't say they've taken that off the table, but they've really diminished the probability of having expectations of an overwhelmed market for soybeans in 2022. At least it's reduced sharply just because the acres aren't there now.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for covering our futures for the week. We previewed it here a moment ago, but we're going to be back with more ahead after this break. We're going to be covering the latest WASDE report. Once again, that was Dan O'Brien. He is our grain market economist here at K-State, covering this week's grain market update report on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. As mentioned before our short break there, we are going to cover our WASDE report now, otherwise known as the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates. We have with us Dan O'Brien. He's our grain market economist here at K-State. So let's go ahead and cover what this latest report has shown. We're going to talk about some highlights here to begin with.
You know, when we look at these World Agricultural Supply Demand Estimate reports, they really do bring to mind for me the focus on the global nature of the commodities. Now, we have some crops in the U.S. that, of course, we're stronger in. We're a predominant producer of corn in the world, along with the South American countries and had been Ukraine. Just as for corn, for soybeans, we're also a predominant soybean producer in the world, although Brazil is certainly strong, if not exceeding our quantity amounts. Now, for wheat, different critter. We're still a major exporter, but there are just a number of countries, and I should say, thankfully, a number of countries that can grow wheat, given the importance of that as a food grain. We're still important there, but we're increasingly finding that transportation issues, logistics, and all of that, and now, in our case, financial market issues with the value of the dollar have put us in a tougher competitive position for the wheat markets. And we're not complaining. I guess you stand back and look at wheat in particular. Here during a time when the world's had so many problems, the Ukraine issue, we would have thought that would have been a time when U.S. wheat exports would have been just tremendous to meet that gap. But it didn't come about. We were about level. And it seemed that there was enough other wheat around the world that other players came in, other major exporters, and we were still there to export wheat if the opportunity would have come. You know, in a major way, again, more like 1.2 or so billion bushels, but we ended up at like 775 million or 800. Just was a thought-provoking thing that U.S. wheat producers, that the U.S. wheat industry has to consider as it goes forward.
In terms of some of the other highlights that we've seen, we're not the only region of the world that's experiencing drought, and that's had major effects on our world markets.
Well, but just reading the highlights off of this WASDE report, they talk about dry conditions persisting in major production regions of the European Union. And both the USDA and now the International Grains Council, following a USDA report earlier in the week, both come out and scale down European wheat production. As they're scaling down European wheat production, then they're reducing the amount of wheat available to be exported out of those countries. That's at play. And then also more concerned about Ukrainian wheat production. That has been lowered again, 10% based on updated government acreage data. had been, and generally production down about 40+% from the previous year. And their harvest is underway. And without bemoaning all that, they have logistical issues, they have fuel availability. The ongoing questions that we talked about earlier with regard to movement to export locations, of both the possibility of now reopening the ports, but probably more the larger ports to the Black Sea, or river traffic to the Danube is now developing. Rail transportation is also developing. So being good entrepreneurial survivors, they're seeking other ways to move grain out of the country. But still, what had been their go-to mode of exports out of Odessa and some of those other major ports is all at risk now. And of course, here in the U.S., if I'm going to give a broad swipe in terms of production, you really didn't see the USDA make any changes in its crop production numbers in that July report. Those, as we had talked about in an earlier segment, those are probably coming in the August report. And for wheat, we may not see the changes until the September 30th small grain summary report. And you do see some changes in domestic consumption. Soybean oil, interesting, is soybean oil consumption's down here in the U.S. Soybean meal increased. And you have some corn usage down about 25 million, sorghum usage about 20. The bigger issue now is with high prices, are we seeing rationing yet? Some would call that demand destruction. I don't know if I'd call it demand destruction. That from a pure economic point of view, I'd call it supply-demand responsiveness to prices. Yeah. It's not destroyed. It's just that as people make profit-maximizing choices on the margin, if something costs a lot, they'll only use what they have to and not extend it so much. And you do see some changes that happened in prices on the wheat price, down just a little bit from what had been seen. The soybean oil price down some. That would be for the old crop market year ending August 31st. Some projections lower for the wheat price for next year, down 25 cents, down to 10.50, had been 10.75. Corn price down 10 cents, down still 6.65. I mean, wonderful prices historically. But soybean price down 30 cents to 14.70. So as the USDA has come in and made their adjustments in that WASDE report, it seems that they're responding to some of what's happened with the futures prices having moved lower in the last month or so.
Let's kind of get into a bit more of the finer details of some of these, specifically when we're thinking about wheat, coarse grains, which of course encompass lots of things, barley, corn, and then oil seeds. Let's go ahead and cover those in a bit more detail, if you don't mind.
So when you look at the wheat supply-demand balance sheet, USDA, in essence, for the U.S., they projected larger supplies, domestic use, exports, and ending stocks. Actually, I have a copy of that report here. And when we say larger, it's only marginally larger. Like for wheat, and now the projection has been raised to 693 million bushels to carry out. We were at 627, so that's really not much of a change. Ending stocks, we're at 33.3%. Now they're at 33.4%. So really, we might say it's larger, but it's only marginally larger. Not a lot of change. So why would the USDA make the changes that they did, and why do we see the wheat futures markets moving lower? Well, in general, they're probably looking at that strong spring wheat crop coming in, 150-some million bushels more, seeing that as a change. Soft red winter was 361 a year ago, projected 376, so at or where it was a year earlier. White wheat was at 201 million bushels a year ago, 286 projected. So our neighbors to the north have had enough moisture that their hard red spring, their white wheat, and their durum wheat has all come in stronger for production, and not just a little bit, but quite a bit. What we're short on down here in hard red winter wheat country, they have more than made up for up to the north.
But moving on to coarse grains, what have we really seen on a global scale as far as coarse grains go?
Yeah, and coarse grains in the world we call feed grains in the United States. So, but it's interesting that in this WASDE report they refer to it as coarse grains, and of course so much of what was going on there because of the predominant position of the United States has to do with what happened with us here with our numbers in terms of acreage and yields. So the overall U.S. supply-demand balance sheet numbers we're projecting for this current marketing year, that'll end August 31st, 1.51 billion bushels of carry out. And the the new numbers for the coming market year, 1.47. So still a reduction. And of course, the I guess risk averse person in me that I as an economist am, I see that and I see these production issues that we've talked about earlier and wonder if that USDA's projection of 14.505 billion bushels will hold up. If you take 250 or 500 million bushels off of that, there'd be some rationing of usage. It doesn't take long with any crop problems in the United States to see that 1.47 billion bushels carry out be closer to 1.3, 1.2 or lower if we get a rough outcome. So I think that the questions in the corn market remain to be answered. The USDA is still projecting $6.65 as a season average price for that next marketing year starting on September 1st. That's down a dime from where they were. But again, I think that's mainly following what the futures have done in the last month. So overall, important to look at. I would say also sorghum, major U.S. Feed grain here in the United States and Kansas in particular. And we have seen a little bit of production decrease. And the acres were up about 100,000 acres, from where they were coming out of the end of June acres report. So 6.305 million acres, and a little bit, just a marginal decline in the outcome in terms of yields. And so that overall balance sheet number projected to be pretty much a sideways move. Ending stocks 30 million bushels, ending price at $6.55, a dime lower than corn. And again, where do we grow grain sorghum? We grow grain sorghum right in the heart of all the hardest hit drought areas. Yep. So I think that number is maybe more at risk just because of where we grow it. Overall, for the world coarse grain situation, they also talk about foreign production being down, reductions in Russia, the EU, Kenya, partially offset an increase in Paraguay. They've got some moisture apparently and good growing conditions in Paraguay. So foreign corn, ending stocks up marginally, really no change. Global corn stocks up about 2.5 million tons. So we talk about global corn stocks. So much depends on what happens with the United States, Brazil, and Argentina as the major players. And at least for the United States, the question where we finally end up at still is on the table.
Once again, that was Dan O'Brien. He's our grain market economist here at K-State, covering the latest WASDE report. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now for our weekly weather update from Chip Redmond, our meteorologist here at K-State. So, Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I wish I could tell you a better story.
I know. I feel like this weather report's not going to be the one that people are going to want to hear, but it's the one we've got. So, we've got a lot of concerns regarding drought.
Yeah, and we had that moisture in June and even some in early July that brought some hope. But now a lot of those long-term forecasts are being verified with current conditions as well as the forecast for the next few weeks. We've had really, really dry conditions across the state. Most of the state has not received any rain. The only exception to the rule is far northeast Kansas, where they got very heavy rain in Brown County, Atkinson County, even into as far west as Nemaha County. But other than that, really, really only very isolated moisture amounts fell across the state this week.
Of course, with drought comes impacts in terms of everything that's growing right now, and that ranges from forage all the way to corn, right?
Yeah, we have browning out of the grasses right now. Any grasses that were green in western Kansas are drying out rapidly. We're also seeing that extend into eastern and even central Kansas as well. So overall, we're not gaining any more forage, and as a result, there's increased stress on feeding cattle. And obviously, there's going to be some impacts with hay amounts and hay availability as a result. Going to the crop side, it's a critical time for corn, and we need moisture right now to keep up with the corn's growth, as well as to really provide that crop with enough moisture for it to bring on corn. And so a stressful time, and unfortunately, looking at soil moisture amounts, there's just nothing there. And with no rain, no soil moisture, especially in that western third to central Kansas where we did see some beneficial rains before, soil moisture is down below 10% in places of saturation at the topsoil level. So we're really depleting moisture quickly.
Sure. And in terms of how this compares to averages this time of year, what are we really looking at? Is it below average, far below average?
Yeah, so right now, precipitation-wise, we average anywhere from an inch in the eastern part of the state to about a half inch to 0.6 of an inch of rain in the west on a weekly basis. So we need that much rain just to break even. And, well, for a lot of the places across the state, they haven't gotten any rain in the last 2 weeks. And as a result, we've seen departures grow as much as 2 inches in places. So obviously a bad situation. And then we factor in the temperatures. Our normal temperatures are warm, but we've been consistently warm. And warmer temperatures increase evaporation and really decrease the amount of impact rainfall can have. And in the rainfall we have seen, it's fallen really hard. And so when it falls fast and hard, it tends to run off, it doesn't soak in well, and it doesn't have a lasting impact.
Sure, you talked about those soil conditions earlier, and that, of course, is a factor that plays into that.
Right. Dry soils are going to basically become hydrophobic to some extent, where they take a very light rain basically to help saturate that soil before it can really absorb moisture. And when we dry it out completely, it becomes hydrophobic, that water runs off and doesn't infiltrate into the ground.
Also, with these concerns of drought come concerns of maintaining water quality and then quantity issues as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, earlier in the summer we had some water quantity concerns, especially for some areas in the Southwest. And we haven't heard of any reports yet. However, when we start to look at projections going out in the future with persistent dry conditions and really above normal temperatures, that concern is definitely going to return and probably return quickly. I know to our south in Oklahoma, there have been several cities that are starting to put on water restrictions because the availability is becoming more limited. And then any water we do have, especially surface water, we start to look at a water quality concern. When we get less water, basically more toxins and more salts and things that build up in those ponds that could lead to potential concerns when you're either irrigating with that water or watering cattle.
Absolutely. Well, as always, Chip, we thank you for your time. Even if it's not always the most optimistic update that we get, we appreciate the update nonetheless.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. That was Chip Redmond. He is our K-State meteorologist with this week's weather report. That concludes today's programming. We'll be back with more next week on Agriculture Today. For Agriculture Today, I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network.